Someone once told me the gospel writers just made Jesus fit Old Testament prophecies, and I couldn't prove them wrong. That terrified me. I used to get defensive when skeptics raised this, shut down the conversation, quote a verse, move on. But late at night, their question haunted me. What if you're believing what you want to believe? What if it's all confirmation bias? I needed to know if my faith could survive the scrutiny. So I stopped defending and started investigating. I spent 2 weeks in the book of Isaiah, cross referencing every messianic prophecy with the Gospels, checking historical records, archaeological findings, and doing statistical probability calculations that I hadn't touched since college. I'm going to walk you through my research. It's a little messy, but what I found changed everything. We're going to look at 5 prophecies from Isaiah, written 700 years before Jesus was born. First, we'll examine what makes these prophecies impossible to manipulate. Then, I'll show you the historical evidence that they were fulfilled. And by the end, you'll see the mathematical probability that makes coincidence statistically absurd. But here's the part that shocked me most. Prophecy that skeptics claim proves Jesus was a fraud, it actually proves the exact opposite. Let's start with the one thing Jesus absolutely could not control, where he was born. Isaiah 7:14. That's about a virgin birth. Where's the location? That's in a different prophet, but Isaiah gives us something even more specific, the Galilee of nations. Now pair that with Micah 5:2, Bethlehem. Here's why that matters. Jesus' parents were from Nazareth in Galilee, but he had to be born in Bethlehem to fulfill the prophecy. So how does a couple from Galilee end up in Bethlehem exactly when a baby is about to be born? Now, this is where skeptics say, see, the gospel writers just made up a census story to force Jesus into Bethlehem. And I didn't have a good answer for that until I checked the historical records. Luke 2, verses 1 to 3 mentions a specific census under Quirinius, the governor of Syria. For decades, critics said this census never happened, that Luke invented it to manufacture the Bethlehem births. But then archaeologists found something in 1764. The Lapis Tiburtinus inscription, a stone fragment that confirms Quirinius served as governor of Syria twice. Once around 6 to 4 BC when Jesus was born, and again in 6 AD, the census most historians know about. Luke wasn't wrong. We just didn't have the evidence yet. And when I saw that archaeological confirmation, something clicked for me. This isn't a circular argument where the Bible proves the Bible. This is external historical evidence confirming the gospel account. Mary and Joseph didn't choose to go to Bethlehem. Rome forced them there through a census that happened exactly when Isaiah's prophecy needed it to. Now hold that thought, because the ancestral lineage prophecy is where things get even more impossible to fake. Isaiah 11:1 says, the Messiah will come from the stump of Jesse, King David's father. To fulfill this, Jesus needed to be a direct descendant of David. Now here's where skeptics say, see, Matthew and Luke just invented those genealogies in chapters 1 and 3. And I'll be honest, I got stuck here for 3 days, because how do you prove a genealogy from 2,000 years ago? But then I found something in the Talmud, Jewish rabbinic writings that were often hostile to Christian claims. The Talmud doesn't dispute Jesus' Davidic lineage. They dispute his interpretation of what the Messiah would do. But they never say he's not from David's line. Why? Because it was public knowledge, the Romans kept meticulous records of Jewish genealogies for tax purposes. If Jesus wasn't from David's line, his enemies would have destroyed his credibility immediately. And that's when it hit me. The very people who wanted to disprove Jesus confirmed the one thing he needed for Isaiah's prophecy. Now, this is where it gets absolutely wild. Isaiah 53:5 says he was pierced. Isaiah wrote this around 700 BC. The Jewish method of execution was stoning. The kar in Hebrew specifically means pierced through or stabbed. But here's the problem. Crucifixion wasn't invented until the Persians developed it around 500 BC, 200 years after Isaiah wrote this, and Rome didn't adopt it until centuries later. So, how does Isaiah predict a method of execution that doesn't exist yet and that Jesus couldn't possibly control? Jesus didn't choose crucifixion, the Roman government did. He was a Jewish rabbi in a Jewish territory under Roman occupation. Jews wanted him stoned for blasphemy, but Pilate insisted on Roman execution, crucifixion. Jesus couldn't manipulate that political dynamic. And this is where the math started to make my head spin. So I pulled out my calculator and started doing conservative probability estimates. Let's be extremely generous to the skeptic position. Probability of being born in Bethlehem, a small town, specific census timing, we'll say 1 in 1,000. Probability of proven Davidic lineage, maybe 1 in 500. Probability of the virgin birth claim with no ancient refutation, maybe 1 in 10,000. Probability of Roman crucifixion versus Jewish stoning, say 1 in 20. The probability of specific piercing method matching Isaiah's word choice, maybe 1 in 100. Now, when you calculate compound probability, independent events all occurring in the same person, you multiply these together. So we have 1,000 times 500 times 10,000 times 20 times 100. That is 1 in 100 trillion. And I'm using conservative estimates that favor coincidence. But here's where I hit a wall. Skeptics could still say maybe the gospel writers just cherry picked prophecies after the fact. So I had to ask, were these prophecies actually about the Messiah, or did Christians just reinterpret them? This is the part that skeptics don't want to touch. The Dead Sea Scrolls, written by Jews before Jesus was born, prove that first century Jews were expecting a Messiah based on these exact Isaiah passages. They interpreted Isaiah 7, 9, 11, and 53 as messianic prophecies before Jesus ever claimed to fulfill them. And here's what's beautiful about this. Christians didn't invent the messianic interpretation. We inherited it from Judaism. The dispute isn't whether Isaiah predicted a Messiah. The dispute is whether Jesus is that Messiah. And when I understood that distinction, everything else clicked into place. The gospel writers weren't manufacturing fulfillment. They were documenting whether this rabbi from Nazareth matched the checklist their own Jewish scriptures provided. So we've seen 5 prophecies: birthplace, ancestral line, virgin birth, Galilee ministry, and crucifixion method. We've examined the historical evidence that they're not inventions. We've calculated the statistical probability of coincidence. But here's the piece that ties it all together. The prophecy I mentioned at the beginning that skeptics claim proves fraud. Isaiah 53:9, it says, his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death. Crucifixion victims were thrown into mass graves with criminals. That was Roman protocol. But Jesus was buried in Joseph of Arimathea's private tomb, a rich man's grave. And here's why that destroys the manipulation theory. The gospel writers were inventing stories to match prophecy. Why would they create a detail that makes no sense in their cultural context? Romans didn't give crucified criminals honorable burials. This is the one detail that would have raised eyebrows among their readers. Wait, how did a condemned criminal end up in a rich man's tomb? But they recorded it anyways, because it happened. And this points to the heart of the gospel: God's sovereignty over human history. 700 years before Jesus was born, God told Isaiah exactly how the Messiah would come. Not vague predictions that could fit anyone, specific, verifiable, uncontrollable details. The virgin birth, the Bethlehem census, the Roman crucifixion method that didn't exist yet, the rich man's tomb that violated protocol. This is why the cross is so stuck. It wasn't plan B. It was prophesied. God wasn't reacting to human sin. He was executing a rescue mission announced 7 centuries in advance. So now when skeptics ask me, how do you know it's not just confirmation bias? I don't get defensive anymore. I pull out my probability calculations. I show them the archaeological evidence. I point to the details Jesus couldn't control. And I invite them to do the math themselves. Look, I'm still learning all this. What prophecies have strengthened your faith or challenged it? Drop a comment. I'll read every one. And if you're skeptical, I genuinely want to hear your pushback. Next week, we'll look at the Nativity, and I'll show you how Catholics and Protestants look at this so differently. Thanks for watching. I'd appreciate a like and a subscribe if you made it this far, and please share this video with somebody that could use it.